Wooden clogs echoed through the dark corridor, lantern light trembling against the wooden walls. The shoji doors slid open, revealing a woman with loose hair, a thin silk kimono draped over her shoulders, her smile tilting like an unspoken invitation. In the imperial palace of 7th century Japan, her name was not spoken with titles, but in whispers about nights that never ended. She took princes, courtiers, even her father's political enemies as lovers. And then, at 30, she was suddenly gone. No announcement, no cause. Only the question, was it illness or a silent execution? In today's video, we uncover the buried, tragic fate of Princess Minabe of Japan. She was born into a dynasty that had already weathered centuries of legend, war, and political intrigue. Princess Minabe, daughter of Emperor Tenji, opened her eyes in the 7th century, an age when Japan was still shaping its imperial identity, when every gesture of the throne was shadowed by the weight of China's Tang court and Korea's Silla kingdom. The Yamato court, with its sprawling wooden palaces and manicured gardens, was less a sanctuary than a chessboard. Each member of the imperial family a piece to be moved, sacrificed, or crowned, depending on the needs of the game. Her birth was not just a personal event. It was a political occurrence, whispered about in corridors lined with paper screens. In an era where lineage was currency, Minabe's bloodline made her valuable beyond measure. She was of pure imperial descent, with the emperor's authority in her veins and the ancestral legitimacy of generations of rulers stretching behind her like a long shadow. Her mother, though less recorded in the chronicles, would have been chosen not for love, but for the strength of her clan and the alliances it could bring. From her earliest days, Minabe lived within the intricate and suffocating ritual of court life. Her first steps were taken on polished wooden floors, beneath the watchful eyes of attendants trained to anticipate her every move. The air in the palace was scented with incense and political tension. Even as a child, she would have known that her smile could be a tool, her silence a weapon. The Yamato court was a world where women could wield influence, but rarely for themselves. A princess could be a bride to cement alliances, a mother to produce heirs, or a pawn to be moved into place during factional disputes. And yet, they were also symbols, public embodiments of grace, refinement, and restraint. Minabe learned these rules early. She learned to sit with her back straight, to speak in measured tones, to let her gaze linger without seeming bold. Yet in the quiet hours, beyond the rigid ceremony, she would have absorbed the other lessons of court. The unspoken language of glances exchanged during poetry readings, the subtle signaling in the choice of a hair ornament, the dangerous thrill of receiving a folded paper note when no one was looking. In Yamato, love and politics were not separate spheres. They intertwined like the threads of a silk kimono, beautiful yet impossible to pull apart without unraveling the whole garment. Her beauty, even in youth, was remarked upon. Court poets described hair that fell like a black river, skin pale as the moon over the lake at Nara, and eyes that seemed to hold a hidden question. Beauty was an asset, but in the palace, it was also a liability. Beauty drew eyes. Eyes drew gossip. Gossip could kill. As she grew, Minabe became increasingly aware that her presence drew not just admiration, but calculation. Princes and nobles who smiled at her in public would speak of her behind folding fans, weighing how her marriage could tip the balance of power. She would have seen the way court ladies aligned themselves with different factions, each trying to ensure survival by attaching themselves to the right patron. In this world, affection was never entirely free of agenda. Her father, Emperor Tenji, was a ruler of ambition and reform. He sought to centralize power, adopting Chinese administrative systems and reshaping the structure of governance. But these reforms came at a cost. They disturbed the existing balance among the noble clans, creating ripples of resentment. Minabe's childhood was thus framed by the soft, almost imperceptible sounds of political discontent. A longer than usual pause after a formal bow, a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, a gift sent but never acknowledged. Within the palace walls, her life was lavish, yet narrow. She would have woken to the soft rustle of silk screens sliding open, servants entering with trays of rice, pickled vegetables, and fish. The morning air would carry the smell of cedar and the faint smoke of incense from the shrine. She would attend lessons in poetry, calligraphy, and court etiquette, her small hands learning to control the brush so that her words flowed like water, never hurried, never uneven. Her childhood was also punctuated by seasonal festivals. In spring, she would watch the cherry blossoms fall, each petal a reminder of beauty's impermanence, a theme that would haunt her life. In summer, there were moon viewing gatherings, where courtiers composed verses while sipping sake. Autumn brought the scent of chrysanthemums and the rustle of silk layers in the cool wind. Winter was a season of stillness, the gardens bare, the ponds iced over, and the palace quieter, as if holding its breath. But beyond the poetry and painted screens, she could not have been blind to the more dangerous currents. Rumors of assassinations, whispered accounts of poisoned cups, and sudden illnesses that removed political rivals overnight were part of her world. She learned early that survival in the palace depended as much on listening as on speaking, and that truth was often less important than perception. Minabe's early life was not one of freedom. It was a life of observation, preparation, and containment. The men around her discussed governance and war. The women discussed marriage prospects, alliances, and how to navigate the desires of those men. For a princess, love was rarely about personal choice. It was about timing, clan strategy, and the careful negotiation of honor and advantage. Still, there must have been moments when she dreamed of something else. Moments when she watched the cranes take flight over the palace gardens and imagined a life without the weight of expectation. But in Yamato, a princess could not fly. She could only walk the corridors laid out for her, step by step, her path already marked by the ink of family politics long before she was born. And so, as she entered her adolescence, Minabe's fate was already narrowing to a single point: marriage. A union that would not just define her personal life, but her political role, her alliances, and ultimately, her place in history. For the daughter of an emperor, there was no question of if she would marry, only to whom, and how that choice would ripple through the empire. It was a destiny she could neither refuse nor fully control. But if the chronicles are to be believed, or at least if the whispers that survive the centuries are, Minabe would one day find ways to reclaim pieces of herself from the rigid machinery of power. For now, though, she was the daughter of the emperor, a jewel in the imperial crown, and a young woman whose life was both protected and imprisoned by the walls of Yamato's palace. The day her marriage was announced, the air in the palace felt different. Servants walked with a touch more stiffness, their eyes lowered, their voices hushed, as though the very walls might overhear them. Princess Minabe was to be wed to Prince Takechi, one of the most politically strategic unions the Yamato court had orchestrated in years. Takechi was no ordinary groom. He was a warrior prince, son of another branch of the imperial family, a man whose loyalty to the throne was unquestioned in public, but whose ambitions were read differently in private. To join him with Minabe was to bind two powerful lines together, closing ranks within the imperial clan and reinforcing Emperor Tenji's vision of a unified court. There was no formal proposal in the way the world understands it today. No moment of surprise or personal choice. The arrangement was delivered to Minabe as a fact, wrapped in the language of honor, duty, and the prosperity of the realm. In Yamato, a princess did not marry for herself. She married for the stability of an empire. The wedding preparations were as meticulous as they were symbolic. Minabe's garments were sewn from the finest silks, dyed in shades that spoke of rank and virtue. Every fold, every color, was chosen not for her preference, but for what it declared to the court: purity, obedience, and her role as a bridge between powerful clans. Her hair, combed and oiled until it shone like black lacquer, was arranged with ornaments that caught the candlelight during the ceremony, dazzling those who dared glance directly at her. The wedding day was a performance, part sacred ritual, part political theater. She sat behind a screen during certain rites, her face glimpsed only in slivers, as if to remind those present that she belonged now to the imperial narrative, not to herself. Offerings were made at the shrine, vows spoken in the formal, elevated language of the court, and sake was sipped from lacquered cups that had passed through the hands of emperors. Takechi, in his ceremonial robes, was every inch the warrior prince, tall, broad-shouldered, with the disciplined bearing of a man accustomed to command. When he looked at her, there was respect, but little warmth. They were not strangers, but neither were they companions. They had shared the same court for years, crossed paths at festivals and formal gatherings, exchanged polite words over scrolls of poetry. Yet now, with the vows complete, they were bound for life. In the first months, Minabe played her role perfectly. She hosted gatherings for court ladies, wrote letters in elegant calligraphy to distant allies, and appeared at Takechi's side during ceremonies. To the outside world, theirs was a harmonious union, a model of imperial propriety. Her grace became the subject of admiration among courtiers. Her composure was taken as proof of the marriage's strength. But behind the paper screens and painted doors, the reality was more complicated. Takechi was consumed by affairs of state and military campaigns. His duties often took him away from the palace for weeks, sometimes months, leaving Minabe in a kind of gilded solitude. The absence was more than physical. Even when he was present, his mind seemed to drift toward matters of strategy and governance. His conversation weighted with the language of politics rather than affection. The palace, once her childhood home, now felt different as a bride. Its corridors seemed longer, its shadows deeper. Her attendants were loyal, but their loyalty was to the institution, not to her personally. Every word she spoke could be repeated, every gesture interpreted. The air carried whispers about who had been seen speaking to whom, about which alliances were shifting behind closed doors. Loneliness in the palace was unlike loneliness anywhere else. It was not the absence of people. There were always people. But the absence of connection. Every interaction was layered with protocol, and every relationship carefully watched. For Minabe, the gap left by Takechi's distance became something she felt acutely. She had been raised to be graceful, compliant, and silent in her longing. But silence has a weight, and over time, it can crush. She began to linger longer at poetry readings, her eyes meeting those of men who understood the unspoken language of longing. A shared verse about autumn leaves could be as charged as a confession. A brief pause while passing in the garden could be an invitation. These were the kinds of subtleties that the Yamato court understood well, small ripples that could swell into waves if noticed by the wrong eyes. For now, however, she remained within the bounds of decorum, her private thoughts hidden behind the delicate mask of her station. The court saw only what she allowed it to see: a dutiful wife, a refined princess, a symbol of imperial harmony. But under the surface, something was shifting. The same intelligence and boldness that had made her a figure of fascination in her youth had not vanished. They had only been buried beneath layers of expectation. And in the stillness of her marriage, those qualities began to stir again. Restless, questioning, and hungry for a kind of closeness that the political machinery of Yamato would never willingly grant her. It would not be long before the first whispers began, and Minabe's name would no longer be spoken only in the context of honor. The first whispers came like the faint rustle of silk in a darkened corridor, soft, almost imperceptible, but carrying the weight of something forbidden. They began as murmurs among the servants, the ones who passed unseen through the palace, whose eyes missed nothing and whose tongues, when loosened, could topple reputations. A lady-in-waiting might mention seeing the princess's lantern light burning late into the night. A guard might speak of footsteps echoing after curfew. In the labyrinth of the Yamato Palace, secrecy was an art form. The architecture itself lent itself to hidden exchanges, long corridors where the light of oil lamps barely reached, gardens where the wind could mask the sound of low voices, chambers connected by sliding doors that could open or close in complete silence. Here, Minabe learned the dangerous skill of carving out moments for herself within the rigid geometry of court life. It began innocently enough, at least in appearance. A longer than necessary exchange during a poetry contest. A smile lingering a fraction of a breath too long as she handed a cup of sake to a visiting nobleman. Her husband, Prince Takechi, often absent on campaigns or immersed in council meetings, noticed little. The court, however, noticed everything. Her first rumored companion was a young prince, striking in both appearance and intellect, known for his talent in composing waka poetry. Their verses began to mirror each other in theme, a subtle courtly game that others pretended not to notice, but recorded in their minds. One evening, during a moon-viewing banquet, the two were seen standing at the edge of the veranda, speaking in tones too soft for anyone to hear, the paper lanterns casting their silhouettes together against the night. Soon there were others. A trusted court musician, his hands skilled not only with the biwa, but in conveying messages wrapped in metaphor. A noble from a rival clan whose presence at the palace was officially diplomatic, yet whose glances toward Minabe were heavy with something more. Even a retainer known for his loyalty to her father was whispered to have shared a private moment with her beneath the plum blossoms when the garden was still. The truth, what was truly said, what was truly done, has been blurred by the centuries. What remains are the rumors, preserved like pressed flowers in the folds of court gossip. Servants swore they heard laughter, low and unrestrained, coming from behind her chamber's shoji at night. Others claimed to see the faint shadow of a man's figure retreating down the hallway as dawn approached. These encounters, whether entirely real or partly imagined, were more than acts of desire. In a court where women's lives were bound to the will of men, such moments could be acts of rebellion. Small, intimate rebellions that declared her ownership over her own body, her own choices. For Minabe, whose marriage was a political calculation rather than a love match, these liaisons, real or rumored, may have been her way of reclaiming what had been denied to her: passion, connection, and the thrill of being seen as a woman rather than a political symbol. But rebellion has a price, especially in the palace. Whispers are never static. They move, they change shape, they become weapons. Every glance she shared became evidence in someone's private ledger. Every moment she was unaccounted for became a story waiting to be told. The danger was not only moral scandal, but political fallout. Some of the men rumored to have been close to her belonged to factions that opposed her husband or her father. In a court where alliances were as fragile as spun glass, such associations could be fatal. To be seen as aligned, intimately, with an enemy was to invite suspicion of treachery. Still, Minabe did not retreat into caution. If anything, the accounts suggest she became bolder, or perhaps simply more indifferent to the consequences. She attended more gatherings, lingered longer in the company of certain men, and allowed her laughter to ring out during sake banquets, even when she knew eyes were on her. The palace gardens became her stage. At twilight, when the lanterns were lit and the sound of koto strings floated on the air, she would walk among the blooming cherry trees, her kimono sleeves trailing along the petals scattered on the ground. The men who joined her in those strolls were never the same twice. Yet the intimacy of those walks was enough to feed the fires of rumor. To the older members of the court, she became an enigma, at once dutiful in public appearances, yet whispered to be reckless in private. To the younger courtiers, she was intoxicating, a living poem of beauty and defiance. To her enemies, she was a liability to be exploited, her reputation an open wound they could use to weaken the imperial image. Whether she knew it or not, Minabe was walking a narrowing path. Each whispered name tied to hers became a knot in a rope slowly tightening around her. In the world of the Yamato court, scandal was never merely about morality. It was a pretext, a tool in the greater game of power. And as the whispers grew louder, they began to take on a new, more dangerous tone. No longer was she simply a woman of rumored lovers. She was becoming a potential political threat. And yet, for all the risk, there is something haunting in the image of her in those nights. Lantern light flickering against her profile, the sound of distant drums from the great hall, the scent of plum blossoms heavy in the cool air. As she laughed, unguarded, for perhaps the only times in her life. It would not last. Shadows lengthened quickly in the palace, and Minabe's would soon stretch into places she could not control. If the whispers of her lovers had been dangerous before, they became lethal once politics entered their bloodstream. In the Yamato court, nothing stayed purely personal for long. A shared glance could be read as an alliance. An overheard laugh could be twisted into evidence of conspiracy. Minabe's name was no longer being spoken only in the context of scandal. It was being written into the margins of political reports, carried in coded language between factions. Among the names most often tied to hers was that of Prince Kusakabe. He was not just another court figure. He was the son of Emperor Tenmu, a man whose claim to power ran parallel to her father's. Kusakabe was young, ambitious, and in the eyes of many, dangerously positioned. His very existence was a reminder that the imperial throne was not secured solely by her father's line. If Minabe's affections truly leaned toward him, or even if it was only the court's perception that they did, it could be read as aligning herself with a rival claimant to the throne. Their supposed connection became a whispered legend. It was said that Kusakabe once gifted her a lacquered comb, its teeth carved from ivory, wrapped in silk the color of midnight. Another tale spoke of a scroll of poetry, lines heavy with longing, slipped to her through the hands of a trusted lady-in-waiting. The reality of these exchanges is impossible to prove now. But in the court, perception was more powerful than proof. Other rumored companions also held dangerous affiliations. One was the nephew of a general who had once opposed her father's reforms. Another was a court scholar whose loyalty was suspect after he had been seen meeting envoys from a rival province. Whether Minabe was aware of the political implications or whether she was simply drawn to their wit, charm, or attention, the effect was the same. Each connection deepened the suspicion around her. The women of the court, always quick to map the web of relationships, began to watch her more closely. What gifts she wore in her hair, which banquets she attended, whose verses she echoed in her poetry. Even the flowers arranged in her chambers could be decoded. A vase of chrysanthemums might be seen as a subtle nod to a certain clan, a branch of plum blossoms as a private signal. What made the situation more volatile was her husband's silence. Prince Takechi was not a man easily provoked, but his distance had become so complete it was almost public. He neither defended her against rumors nor confronted her about them, which allowed the speculation to grow unchecked. Some believed he was gathering his own quiet evidence. Others thought he was simply indifferent, letting her dig her own grave. It was in this atmosphere that the first hints of a larger plot began to surface. Court gossip shifted from idle scandal to strategic conversation. If Minabe truly favors Kusakabe, could she be persuaded to influence the emperor? Could she, in her position, pass information? Could she, by the child she bears, tie the imperial bloodline to another faction entirely? The palace was a place of many watchers, and not all of them wore the robes of courtiers. Spies moved in plain sight. Gardeners, scribes, attendants, each loyal to different masters. In the back corridors, messengers carried folded paper slips, their inked characters written in careful, ambiguous phrasing that could be read as love poems or military codes depending on the reader's intent. Minabe herself began to notice the change. Where once she could slip away for a quiet walk in the gardens, now she found footsteps behind her. Conversations that had once been private began to feel staged, as though certain words were meant to be overheard. Even her most trusted attendants seemed to be measuring their speech before her, weighing which of her answers might later be repeated. And yet, she did not retreat. If anything, she seemed to lean into the tension, attending more gatherings, seeking out the company of those already linked to her in rumor. Perhaps it was defiance. Perhaps it was the only way she knew to assert her agency in a life where nearly every choice had been made for her. Or perhaps, most dangerously, it was that she had begun to believe she could navigate the storm. It was a dangerous calculation. In the court, love was never just love, and alliances were rarely made in innocence. A woman in her position, bound by marriage to one power and whispered to favor another, could become the spark in a palace fire, or the casualty buried in its ashes. By now, the quiet amusement that had once colored her scandal had faded. What replaced it was sharper, colder. Conversation ceased when she entered a room. Certain nobles began to avoid her entirely, fearing that mere proximity could be read as complicity. Others, sensing opportunity, drew closer, offering veiled sympathies that were in truth tests of loyalty. The palace, with its painted screens and polished floors, had become a battlefield without weapons. Every word, every silence, every tilt of her head was ammunition. And in this unarmed war, Minabe's beauty and intelligence were no longer her protection. They were her vulnerability. The web around her was tightening. Soon, it would no longer matter whether the rumors of her lovers were true. In Yamato, truth was a fragile thing. Perception was the only currency that counted. And the perception now was clear. Princess Minabe was not merely a woman of scandal. She was a woman whose heart or whose loyalty belonged to someone other than her husband. A conclusion like that, in the wrong hands, could be fatal. The first signs were subtle, an extra cushion placed discreetly behind her back during audiences, a new looseness in the way her silk robes were tied, her hands resting more often against her abdomen as she walked through the palace gardens. At first, it was spoken of only in polite, hopeful terms. The princess was with child. In the Yamato court, such news should have been cause for celebration. A reassurance of lineage, a strengthening of the imperial bloodline. But for Minabe, the moment her condition became visible, the air around her shifted in a way she could feel without anyone saying a word. Pregnancy in the palace was never simply about life. It was about blood, and blood was politics. The child she carried would not only inherit her face or her manner, it would inherit the legitimacy of an imperial line. If that line was questioned, if even the faintest suspicion clung to it, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for her, but for entire factions. The whispers began almost immediately. Whose child was it? The question was dangerous enough that no one dared voice it publicly, but it threaded through the court in the form of careful glances, unfinished sentences, and sidelong stares. Those who had long opposed her seemed to grow more watchful. Those who had once admired her kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with the uncertainty that now surrounded her. Prince Takechi's reaction, or rather his lack of one, was itself a statement. He made no public proclamation of joy, no outward gestures of affection toward his pregnant wife. He attended the required ceremonies, but left quickly afterward. At meals, he was silent, his eyes on the lacquered table rather than on her. In the privacy of their chambers, he spoke little, and when he did, his voice carried the flat tone of formality rather than intimacy. His detachment was not loud, but it was noticed. In a court where every gesture could be read as signal, it was enough to suggest to some that the prince himself harbored doubts. The rumors that had once been the stuff of titillating gossip now gained a sharper edge. They did not merely suggest indiscretion. They questioned legitimacy. And legitimacy, in the Yamato court, was the very spine of power. A child suspected of carrying the blood of a rival could not be allowed to live, not as a potential heir. The stakes had shifted from moral scandal to dynastic survival. Even her daily routines were no longer her own. Physicians were assigned to monitor her, but she could feel that their loyalty was not to her health, but to the interests of those who had placed them there. Servants were replaced without explanation, familiar faces disappearing from her chambers overnight. Meals were brought to her under the watch of attendants she did not know well. And though the food was tested in the formal way, she found herself pushing it aside, her appetite lost more from suspicion than nausea. The corridors she once walked freely now seemed lined with eyes. Conversation ceased when she approached. Footsteps followed her at a distance she could not close. Even the garden, once her sanctuary, felt watched. She noticed a particular guard who seemed to be posted wherever she went, his expression unreadable, his presence constant. Whether he was there for her protection or her surveillance, she could not tell. Her most trusted lady-in-waiting, perhaps sensing the tightening noose, warned her in a whisper one evening, "You must be careful, my lady. In these walls, the truth does not matter, only what they choose to believe." The word struck Minabe harder than she let show. She had always understood that perception ruled the palace, but now she was seeing how it could erase a person before they even had a chance to defend themselves. As the months passed, the palace's atmosphere toward her grew colder. Invitations to gatherings dwindled. The gifts sent to her chambers were fewer, and those that came were perfunctory. A vase of plain bamboo, a roll of unadorned cloth, stripped of the personal touches that once marked genuine goodwill. Even the poetry contests, where she had once been a central presence, continued without her. her absence noted but not remarked upon. There were moments when she felt the weight of the child within her, not as a promise, but as a sentence. She had no illusions about how fragile a life could be in the palace. She had seen other women vanish from the record, their names surviving only in rumor. In her darker thoughts, she wondered if she would live to see this child's face, or if her pregnancy itself was the fuse that would ignite her downfall. The most dangerous thing about her situation was that the truth, whatever it was, no longer mattered. If the factions who wanted her gone could convince enough people that the child was not Takechi's, then no physician's testimony, no private oath could undo the damage. And if her husband himself was not willing to claim the child without hesitation, the ground beneath her was already gone. In the nights when she could not sleep, she would sit by the lamp and watch the shadows of the shoji panels tremble with the wind, wondering which of them might hide the eyes of someone sent to end her story. Her life, once ruled by the subtle games of courtship and favor, had narrowed to a single question. A question that no one would ask her directly, but which she could hear in the silence of every room she entered. Whose blood does this child carry? It was a question that would decide her fate. And in the Yamato court, once that decision was made, it would not be reversed. It happened on a night when the palace should have been at its most alive. Lanterns glowed in the corridors, their soft light spilling across the polished cedar floors. The air smelled of incense and roasted fish from the kitchens, the hum of voices carrying from a banquet in one of the great halls. Minabe had been summoned there, not as the evening's focus, but as a decorative presence, seated among the women of the court, dressed in layered silks that concealed the curve of her belly, her smile carefully composed. The banquet was like so many others. Trays of lacquered dishes, cups of warm sake refilled by quiet attendants, bursts of polite laughter at the witty turns of a poet's verse. But beneath the laughter, the currents of politics moved as sharply as ever. Minabe could feel them in the way certain eyes lingered on her, not with admiration, but with the assessing look of a gambler considering the odds. She had become more than a wife, more than a princess. She was a potential risk to be eliminated. Some accounts claim she took only a few sips of sake that night. Others say it was a delicacy, a small piece of river fish, glazed and delicate, that she tasted. Still others whisper of a sweet dumpling brought to her by a lady she did not know well. The details shift with the teller, but they all agree on what came next. At first, it was a tightening in her stomach, the kind she had learned to endure during her pregnancy. But it grew sharper, twisting into something that made her grip the edge of the low table until her knuckles whitened and her breath quickened. Her vision began to blur. The voices around her became muffled, as though she were sinking underwater. She tried to rise, but her legs would not obey. A servant rushed forward, then froze, uncertain whether to touch her without the signal of a superior. Someone, perhaps a court physician, was called, but the minutes between the summons and his arrival stretched unbearably. By the time he came, Minabe was shivering despite the warmth of the room, sweat beading on her forehead, her skin pale enough to seem almost translucent in the lantern light. She was carried from the hall, her silk robes trailing like spilled water behind her. In her private chamber, attendants scrambled, placing wet cloths on her brow, burning more incense as though purifying the air might drive the sickness away. Her breathing came in short, shallow bursts. The pain in her abdomen rose and fell like a tide. Some said it was food poisoning. Others whispered of a sudden fever. But in the palace, no one was naive. Illness could be summoned by nature or by a human hand. a single pinch of the right powder in a cup of tea could mimic the symptoms of disease. A tiny drop of liquid on a delicacy could bring about an end so swift that even the court physicians could not name it. Minabe's mind, in those final hours, may have wandered through the corridors of her own life, through the gardens where she once walked under plum blossoms, through the evenings of stolen glances and whispered poems, through the weight of her unborn child pressing gently against her from within. Perhaps she wondered whether this was punishment, whether she had been too bold, or whether the decision to end her had been made long before, her actions merely the excuse. No public statement came from Prince Takechi. He remained in his quarters, attending neither the frantic hours of her decline nor the final moments of her life. Whether this was an act of grief or detachment, no one could say. His absence was noted, recorded silently in the memories of those who watched and waited for some sign of how the court would frame her death. By dawn, the palace was quiet. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt incense and damp silk. Minabe was gone. 30 years old, still young, still carrying a child whose first cry would never be heard. Her attendants wept quietly, not only for her but for themselves, for they knew their fates were tied to hers. The news was not announced to the people in any grand proclamation. There were no bells rung in mourning, no extended ceremonies. A brief notice was sent through the official channels. The princess had died, cause unspecified. The body was prepared quickly, wrapped in fine cloths, and taken to be buried with the appropriate rites. Yet the speed of the burial left little room for private goodbyes. To those who had loved her, or at least admired her, there was a sense of something stolen. Not only her life, but the truth of her death had been taken and locked away in the archives that would never be shown to the public. To others, her passing was a calculated removal, one that erased a dangerous variable from the fragile equations of court politics. In the silence that followed, the rumors swelled again. Was it a rival lover's betrayal? A husband's silent consent? A father's ruthless command? Or simply the slow work of poison, chosen not for its speed, but for the way it could blur the lines between illness and murder? Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Minabe was gone, and with her went the child whose bloodline could have altered the balance of the imperial court. In the records, her death was just a line. In the shadows of the palace, it was a warning. And though her voice would never again be heard in the halls of Yamato, the whispers about her lovers, her defiance, her beauty, would echo long after the incense from her funeral had faded into the air. It did not take long for the palace to begin its quiet work. In the aftermath of Minabe's death, there was no mourning period that matched her rank. No public recitations of her virtues, no grand ceremonies to honor her memory. Instead, her name began to slip, almost imperceptibly, from the official tongue of the court. In a place where words could immortalize, silence was the sharpest blade. The chroniclers, those keepers of the imperial record, were masters of omission. They did not lie. They simply chose what not to write. In the great scrolls detailing the events of the year, her passing was reduced to a single, sparse line. In the Xth month, the Princess Minabe passed away. There was no mention of her age, no description of her illness, no acknowledgement of the child she carried. Her life, which had once been woven into the political fabric of Yamato, was now distilled into a fragment that could pass unnoticed to any future reader. In the women's quarters, her possessions were sorted without ceremony. The lacquered combs, the silk robes, the poetry scrolls, items that had once been markers of her identity, were quietly redistributed or burned. A few pieces were stored away in chests, but these were not labeled in her name. They became objects without owners, unanchored from the woman who had once worn or touched them. Her portrait, a painted screen that had stood in a side chamber, vanished. Some say it was dismantled, the silk repurposed, the pigments washed away in water until her face was nothing but a faint ghost in the weave. Others whisper that it was kept by someone in secret, hidden away in a storeroom. The only surviving image of the princess, whose beauty had once been the talk of the court. The erasure was not just physical. It was spoken into being through the way people referred to her, or rather, stopped referring to her at all. The ladies who had once attended her learned to speak of that time without names. The younger courtiers heard rumors, but were discouraged from asking questions. Minabe became an unperson, a shadow you could feel in the room, but could not name without risk. Outside the palace, in the villages and towns beyond the capital, her story lingered longer. Servants who had been dismissed after her death carried fragments of her memory into the wider world. They spoke in half-truths over cups of sake in back rooms of inns. Of her laughter under the plum blossoms, of the forbidden love poems, of the night she fell ill after a banquet. But these stories, passed from mouth to mouth, changed shape each time they were told. With no written record to anchor them, they began to blur into legend. The court preferred it that way. A woman like Minabe, if left intact in history, could become a symbol of defiance, saimance, of vulnerability, of the danger women faced when they stepped beyond the lines drawn for them. Symbols were powerful. They could inspire. But a ghost, half forgotten and half invented, posed less of a threat. And so, the official Yamato narrative moved on. Other marriages were arranged, other political intrigues unfolded, other births and deaths took precedence in the chronicles. The pages where her story might have been told were filled instead with records of harvests, appointments to court positions, the arrival of foreign envoys. The absence of her name was as deliberate as any decree. Still, traces of her resisted complete burial. In the spring, when the cherry blossoms bloomed, some of the older court women would pause beneath the petals and remember how Minabe once walked there in her pale pink silk, the flowers catching in her hair. At night, in the long corridors lit only by oil lamps, attendants claimed to hear the faint sound of wooden clogs and the rustle of silk, though no one was there. It is said that one poet, too afraid to name her outright, composed a verse that spoke of a blossom cut before the full moon's rise, whose fragrance lingers on the sleeves of those who dared to touch it. The poem circulated quietly among the younger courtiers, copied by hand, its meaning obvious to anyone who had known her. Eventually, the poem too was banned, though it survived in private collections, waiting centuries to be rediscovered. By the time a generation had passed, the real Minabe had been almost entirely replaced by the Minabe of whispers, a woman known more for the scandalous shadows around her life than for her actual deeds. Her erasure was nearly complete, yet it carried an irony the court could not control. The more they tried to silence her, the more irresistible her story became to those who lived on the margins of power. In the grand audience hall, where once she might have been seated in silks beside her husband, there was no trace she had ever existed. But in the minds of those who remembered, she remained vivid, walking the palace gardens at dusk, laughing softly in the corner of a banquet, her kimono sleeve brushing against the arm of a man whose name history would also choose to forget. Minabe had been a daughter of the emperor, a wife to a prince, a possible mother to an heir, and yet, in the official record, she was barely a line. It was as though she had been erased, not only from the present, but from the very idea of the past. And in that silence, her ghost began to take on a life of its own. History had tried to bury her, but it had only managed to plant her deeper. In the years after her erasure from the official scrolls, Minabe ceased to exist as a political figure and began to live as a symbol, reshaped, refracted, and retold through the mouths of those who had never seen her face, but could feel the pull of her story. She appeared first in whispers at night markets and over cooking fires, her name spoken cautiously among women who had themselves known the weight of rules that bent only one way. In these tellings, she was not a princess defined by her marriage or her lovers. She was a warning, or sometimes a secret kind of inspiration. The details changed depending on the teller. Some made her a tragic victim. Others painted her as a fearless seductress who chose passion over duty. Still others as a pawn crushed in a game she never agreed to play. Her image began to slip into poetry and song, though never openly. In verses recited at spring festivals, she became the blossom that blooms in the moonless night, a metaphor for beauty that defied the timing decreed by the season. Street musicians wove ballads about a woman in the palace whose laughter could be heard over the sound of drums, but whose body was carried out before dawn. Even if no name was given, everyone understood who it was meant to be. In folklore, she began to wear the trappings of myth. Some said she had been poisoned by a jealous consort. Others claimed she had faked her death and escaped into the countryside, living out her days under another name. A more romantic version told of her spirit wandering the palace gardens, forever searching for the child she never held. The truth was irrelevant. What mattered was that she had become a vessel into which people could pour their own fears and desires about love, betrayal, and the fragile power of women. The cherry blossom became the symbol most closely tied to her memory. It was easy to see why. The blossom's beauty was fleeting. Its fall was both graceful and final. In the villages beyond the capital, women began to tell their daughters that to live like Minabe was to bloom brilliantly, but to know that such brilliance could draw the wind. In the court, older attendants, careful never to say her name, would still pause at a tree heavy with blossoms and bow slightly, as if acknowledging a ghost among the petals. For those in power, her story was a lesson about containment. She became the cautionary tale whispered to young noblewomen entering the palace for the first time. Know the rules. Know your place. Do not give the court reason to speak your name. To those outside the palace, she became a quiet rebellion, a reminder that even in a world where your life could be scripted before your birth, there was still a way to seize moments for yourself, even if the cost was high. As the generations passed, the edges of her life blurred further. Historians working with the fragments of early Yamato records found little more than a name, a date of death, and a few disputed family connections. But the oral traditions kept her alive in ways ink never could. The Minabe of the people was richer, more complicated, and more contradictory than the Minabe of the court had ever allowed. It was perhaps inevitable that artists would reclaim her. Centuries later, a painter in the Heian period created a folding screen depicting a woman in pale pink silk walking through a garden at night, her face turned away from the viewer. It was said to be inspired by the blossom who defied the season. And though her name was absent, the court knew exactly who it was meant to be. The piece survived. And in modern times, historians would point to it as one of the few surviving visual echoes of her life. In literature, she became a mirror for the changing views of women in power. Playwrights in later centuries made her the tragic heroine of no dramas, her voice echoing from the underworld, recounting the night she died. Poets in the Edo period reframed her as a dangerous beauty whose charms could topple a dynasty. In both cases, she was larger than life, a figure to be feared, pitied, or admired, depending on the storyteller's intent. For the people of Yamato's later eras, she was also a reminder of how quickly the palace could turn on its own. Her story, stripped of official detail yet rich in emotional truth, became an unspoken salmon between generations of women who understood that their worth was often measured against the needs of men and the fragility of alliances. Minabe's life and death became the coded language of those who had to navigate those same treacherous waters. And so, the symbol she became was double-edged. To the court, she was a cautionary emblem, proof of the danger in stepping beyond the invisible boundaries. To the people, she was a quiet patron saint of the ungovernable heart. And to history, she was a reminder that erasure does not always mean disappearance. Sometimes it means transformation. Centuries after her burial, a scholar writing about the women of early Japan ended his account of her with a single, haunting line. They erased her from the page, but the wind still carries her name through the blossoms. Her story refuses to lie still. Even more than a millennium after her death, Princess Minabe's life continues to stir the same questions that once swirled in the candlelit corners of the Yamato court. They are questions about desire, power, and the limits of freedom. Questions that remain uncomfortably relevant in the modern world. The first and most persistent question is the one whispered in the palace the night she died. Was it illness or execution? The official records leave no clue. The chroniclers of the era, whose brushes could be as deadly as swords, wrote her passing in neutral ink, neither accusing nor defending. That deliberate void invites speculation. Was she removed because she threatened the balance of power? Because she carried a child whose paternity could destabilize a dynasty? Or simply because she had become too vivid, too memorable, in a court that preferred its women silent and invisible? The second question is one of agency. Did Minabe truly choose the lovers she was rumored to have? Or were those choices shaped and perhaps manipulated by the men and factions around her? In the popular imagination, she is alternately a seductress and a victim, a calculating player and a pawn. But perhaps she was something messier, something truer. A woman who sought intimacy in a life where affection was rationed, who reached for joy in a place where joy was not part of her assigned duties. Her story also forces us to confront the enduring tension between private life and public judgment. The palace of the 7th century was a confined world, yet its dynamics are strangely familiar to anyone who has seen how public opinion forms in the present. A rumor, repeated enough times, hardens into truth. Silence from those in power is taken as confirmation, and the accused, especially if they are women, are expected to defend themselves without ever showing anger, because anger itself becomes part of the case against them. In this way, Minabe's fate mirrors the stories of countless women across time. Queens, empresses, consorts, even ordinary wives in small villages, all have faced the double standard that polices their behavior more strictly than any man's. In her world, a prince could take lovers without threatening his position. A princess who did the same could lose her life. The imbalance was not hidden. It was woven into the very fabric of court life. There is also the question of whether the truth even matters in such cases. If she was innocent of political treachery, does that absolve her in the eyes of history? Or does the fact that her perceived guilt was enough to destroy her mean that innocence was irrelevant from the start? Minabe's erasure shows the brutal efficiency of perception. When those who hold power decide a narrative, the reality beneath it becomes little more than a footnote. Perhaps the most haunting question is what might have happened if she had been allowed to live. Would she have raised her child quietly in the palace, fading into the background of the court's formal duties? Or would she have continued to test the boundaries of her life, pushing back against the invisible walls until they closed around her again? We cannot know. And it is the unanswerable nature of these questions that keeps her story alive. In modern Japan, her name is not among the most famous in imperial history. She does not have the mythic weight of Himiko or the political legacy of Empress Jito. Yet in certain circles, among historians of women's lives, among poets and playwrights, Minabe is a figure who refuses to be neatly categorized. She is a mirror, and what you see in her reflects what you bring. For some, a warning. For others, a spark of defiance. The debates about her life often circle back to one central dilemma. Can sexuality and political power coexist for a woman without one being used to destroy the other? In her lifetime, the answer was clearly no. And though centuries have passed, the tension remains. Even today, when women in public life face scrutiny, the first attacks often aim at their private relationships, as though intimacy itself could undermine their competence. Minabe's story also asks something of us as listeners and tellers of history. How do we speak for those who were silenced? Do we repeat the accusations of their enemies, or do we search for the human being behind the scandal? Every retelling of her life becomes a small act of resistance against the erasure that followed her death. The last question is perhaps the most personal. What was she thinking in her final hours? Was she afraid? Defiant? Resigned? Did she regret the choices she made, or did she cling to them as proof that she had lived on her own terms, however briefly? This question lingers like the fading smoke of incense. It will never be answered, but it scents the entire memory of her. And so, more than 1,000 years later, Minabe's life remains an open case file in the court of human memory. The evidence is incomplete, the witnesses long gone, the verdict forever in dispute. Yet in the gaps between fact and legend, she endures, not as a line in a chronicle, but as a challenge to look closer, to question more deeply, and to remember that the silence of the record is not the silence of the truth. History tells us that Princess Minabe died young, erased from the record, her story reduced to a line of ink. But I don't believe that is the end of it. When I think of her, I don't see a scandal or a political liability. I see a woman trapped inside a system that treated her as a piece to be moved, until she moved herself, however briefly, in ways the court could not control. It's easy to judge her from a distance, to see the rumors and the whispers and conclude she brought it on herself. But I think that view is too small, too neat for the complexity of a life like hers. If you've ever felt the walls closing in, ever been told your choices are already made for you, then you know something of the world she lived in. You know how dangerous it is to want more than you are given. And maybe that's why her story still matters. Because it's not just about a princess in 7th century Japan, it's about what happens when power fears desire, and when desire refuses to be silent. It's about the cost of being remembered for the wrong reasons, and the greater cost of not being remembered at all. So I choose to remember her, not as the nymphomaniac queen her enemies wanted her to be, not as a cautionary tale to frighten others into obedience, but as a human being, flawed, vivid, and unwilling to let her life be written entirely by other hands. If we let stories like hers disappear, we lose more than names. We lose the chance to understand ourselves and to see the patterns that still repeat. We owe it to the forgotten, the erased, and the silenced to speak them back into the world. And if you want to keep uncovering the lives history tried to bury, queens, rebels, and the ones who walk the fine line between, then make sure you subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled. Like this video, share it, and help us keep these shadows lit. Because every time we tell their stories, we pull them a little further out of the dark.